I discovered that the three people I'd grown to love as my long-lost family members over the past 8 months, the sister who called me every Tuesday evening to share childhood memories I'd somehow forgotten, the nephew who sent me handwritten letters about his dreams of opening a bakery, and the cousin who drove 4 hours just to bring me homemade soup when I mentioned feeling under the weather. We're all professional actors hired by my own daughter Rebecca to manipulate me into changing my will and steal my $3 million inheritance. And the devastating truth only came to light when I walked into what I thought would be a joyful family reunion in my living room and overheard them discussing their payment schedules and coaching notes while they thought I was still in the kitchen. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. My name is Margaret Aliner Thompson, though most people call me Maggie, and I'm 74 years old, living alone in the same powder blue Victorian house in Charleston, South Carolina, where my late husband Charles and I raised our daughter Rebecca and built what I thought were the happiest years of our lives together. The house sits on Magnolia Street with its wraparound porch painted white as fresh cotton and gardens that Charles tended with the kind of patience I wish I'd shown in raising our only child. Charles passed 3 years ago this October on a Tuesday morning that started like any other. He'd been reading the newspaper in his favorite leather chair, the one with the worn armrest where he'd rest his coffee cup, when his heart simply decided it was time to stop. The doctor said it was quick, peaceful, but there's nothing peaceful about finding the love of your life slumped over the morning crossword, his reading glasses still perched on his nose, his pencil fallen from fingers that had held mine for 46 years. The months following Charles's death blurred together like watercolors. Well-meaning neighbors brought casseroles I barely touched. My sister Ruth called every Sunday from Atlanta with updates about her grandchildren that felt like reports from another planet. And Rebecca, my 45-year-old daughter with her sharp auburn hair and sharper tongue, swept in periodically to organize things I didn't want organized and suggest changes I wasn't ready to make. Rebecca had always been what Charles diplomatically called ambitious. Even as a child, she'd calculated every decision based on potential benefit, every friendship measured by what advantages it might provide. When she was 12, she'd convinced 3 classmates to do her science project while she managed what she called quality control. By 16, she was running elaborate schemes to get out of chores by manipulating her father and me against each other. As an adult, she'd turned that manipulation into a career of sorts, jumping from one get-rich-quick scheme to another, always needing just one more loan, one more investment, one more chance to prove she could strike it big. Her relationship with money had always been complicated, but after Charles died and she realized the extent of our estate, something shifted in her demeanor. She became more attentive, more present, but in a way that felt calculated rather than loving. She'd visit twice a week instead of twice a month, always bringing flowers and asking detailed questions about my will, my investments, my plans for the future that felt less like concern and more like reconnaissance. "Mom, you know how much I worry about you rattling around in this big house all alone," she'd say, settling into Charles's chair like she belonged there. "Have you given any thought to updating your will, making sure everything's current and reflects your actual wishes?" The way she said actual wishes always made me uncomfortable, as if she suspected I might be harboring secret desires to leave everything to the local cat shelter. The truth was, Charles and I had been very deliberate about our estate planning. We'd worked with a trusted attorney to set up a will that would provide for Rebecca's future while also supporting the causes we cared about. 60% of our assets would go to Rebecca, with the remaining 40% divided between the Charleston Children's Hospital, where Charles had volunteered for 15 years, the local literacy foundation where I taught reading to adults, and a scholarship fund we'd established at the community college. Rebecca knew about these arrangements, and while she'd never openly complained, I could see the calculations running behind her green eyes every time the subject came up. $3 million split 60-40 meant she'd inherit $1.8 million, which should have been more than enough to secure anyone's future. But for Rebecca, enough was never quite enough. The first hint of what was coming appeared in my life like a gentle spring rain, so soft and welcome that I never thought to question where the clouds had originated. It was a Tuesday evening in February about 8 months ago when my phone rang with a call from a number I didn't recognize. The area code was from Iowa, and my first instinct was to let it go to voicemail, assuming it was another telemarketer or robocall. But something made me answer, maybe the particular loneliness of that February evening when the winter darkness seemed to press against my windows like a living thing. "Hello," I said, settling into the kitchen chair where I'd been half-heartedly working on a crossword puzzle. "Is this Margaret Thompson?" The voice was female, middle-aged, with a slight tremor that spoke of nervousness or emotion. "This might sound crazy, but I think I'm your sister." The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd been an only child, or so I'd always believed. My parents, both gone now for over 20 years, had never mentioned another daughter, never hinted at any siblings I might have somewhere in the world. "I'm sorry," I managed, "but I think you might have the wrong number. I don't have a sister." "Please don't hang up," the woman said quickly. "My name is Linda Patterson. I was born Linda Margaret Williams in Summerville, South Carolina on April 15, 1952. Our parents were Thomas and Elizabeth Williams. I was given up for adoption when I was 18 months old." The names hit me like stones thrown at glass. Thomas and Elizabeth Williams had indeed been my parents. April 15, 1952 would have made this woman exactly 2 years younger than me. But adoption? I'd never heard whisper of another child, never seen any evidence that my parents had given up a baby. "I've been searching for my biological family for most of my adult life," Linda continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "It took until recently, with all these DNA testing services and genealogy websites, to piece together enough information to find you. Margaret, I think you're my older sister, and I've been hoping for this conversation for 30 years. The emotion in her voice was so raw, so genuine, that I found myself gripping the phone tighter. Even if this was some kind of mistake, this woman's pain was real, her longing was real. "Tell me more," I heard myself saying. "Tell me what you remember." What followed was a conversation that lasted nearly 2 hours. Linda painted a picture of our parents that was both familiar and startling. She described my father's habit of humming while he shaved, a detail so specific and accurate that my chest tightened with recognition. She knew about my mother's collection of blue glass bottles that sat on the kitchen windowsill, catching the morning light like captured sky. But she also shared memories I'd never heard before. Stories about family financial struggles during the early years of their marriage, about difficult decisions and heartbreaking choices that my parents had apparently never shared with me. "They kept a photograph," Linda said quietly. "The adoptive family showed it to me when I turned 18. A picture of them holding me as a baby with a little girl standing beside them. The little girl had dark curls and was wearing a yellow dress with tiny white flowers." I had that same photograph somewhere in my memory box upstairs. Me at age 2, standing next to my parents, wearing exactly the dress Linda had described. But in my version of the photo, there was no baby, just me and my parents, or so I'd always thought. Had there been another child in that picture? Had my memory simply edited out a sister I'd been too young to understand I was losing? "Linda," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper, "if this is true, if you really are my sister, why didn't they ever tell me? Why did they give you up and keep me?" Her answer came with the weight of decades of wondering. From what I could piece together through records and conversations with my adoptive parents, it was about money. Dad had just lost his job at the textile mill, and Mom was struggling with what we'd probably call postpartum depression today. They couldn't afford to keep both of us, and you were older, more established in their lives. They chose to keep you and give me a chance at a better life with a family that could provide for me. The sacrifice in that decision, the impossible choice between 2 beloved children, made my heart ache for parents I'd never fully understood. Had they lived with that guilt their entire lives? Had they looked at me and sometimes seen the ghost of the daughter they'd given away? Over the following weeks, Linda and I talked almost daily. She sent me photographs from her life, pictures that showed a woman who shared my mother's gentle smile and my father's stubborn chin. She'd grown up in Iowa with loving adoptive parents who'd given her every opportunity, had married a kind man who died too young of cancer, had raised 2 sons who were now adults with families of their own. But despite the blessings in her life, she'd always felt the hollow ache of not knowing where she came from, of missing the biological connections that anchor most people to their place in the world. "I used to stare at strangers in grocery stores," she confessed during one of our late-night conversations, "wondering if any of them might be my family, wondering if I'd recognize my own blood if I saw it." The more we talked, the more convinced I became that Linda really was my sister. She knew too many specific details, shared too many physical characteristics, felt too genuinely connected to our family history for this to be some elaborate deception. When she suggested that we meet in person, I was eager to finally embrace the sister I'd unknowingly mourned my entire life. But before that meeting could happen, another call came. This time from a young man with a warm, slightly nervous voice who identified himself as David Thompson. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, "I know this is going to sound strange, but I believe your late husband Charles might have been my grandfather." David explained that he was 38 years old, living in Asheville, North Carolina, working as a carpenter and raising 2 teenage daughters on his own after his wife left 3 years ago. His own father had died when David was young, and his paternal grandmother had recently passed, leaving behind a box of old papers and photographs that included pictures of a man who looked remarkably like David himself. When I started researching the names and dates on the back of these photos, everything pointed to Charleston and to Charles Thompson, David said. The more I dug, the more convinced I became that my father was Charles's son from before he married you, maybe from a relationship he had in his early 20s that he never told you about. The possibility that Charles might have had a child before we met wasn't entirely shocking. We'd both been in our mid-20s when we started dating, both had lives and relationships that predated our marriage. Charles had been in the Army, stationed in various places around the country, and he'd been private about those years, saying only that he'd sown his wild oats and was ready to settle down with the right woman. David sent me photographs, and the resemblance to Charles was indeed striking. The same broad shoulders, the same way of tilting his head when he smiled, the same hands that I'd memorized over decades of marriage. When David smiled, I could see Charles at 30, young and hopeful and unaware of the life we'd build together. "I'm not looking for money or inheritance," David assured me during our second conversation. "I just want to know about my grandfather, about the family I never knew I had. My daughters are curious about their heritage, and I'd love for them to meet their step-grandmother if you're open to that." The idea of having granddaughters, even step-granddaughters, filled a hollow place in my heart that I'd barely acknowledged existed. Rebecca had never had children, claiming that motherhood would interfere with her career ambitions, and I'd resigned myself to never experiencing the joy of grandchildren. The possibility of teenage girls who might want to learn my famous chocolate chip cookie recipe or hear stories about their grandfather's younger days felt like an unexpected gift. The third family member to emerge from the shadows of my past was Maria Santos, who called in early April claiming to be my cousin from my mother's side. Maria was 59, living in Savannah, Georgia, just a few hours south of Charleston. She explained that her mother, Carmen, had been my mother Elizabeth's younger sister, separated from the family during the chaos of the Great Depression when different relatives had taken in different children. Mama always talked about her sister Elizabeth who lived in South Carolina, Maria said in a voice that carried the musical cadence of coastal Georgia. She kept a prayer card with Elizabeth's picture in her Bible until the day she died, always hoping they'd find each other again someday. When I started doing genealogy research after Mama passed, your name was the first one that popped up. Maria's story felt different from Linda's and David's. Where they had approached me with careful uncertainty, Maria bubbled over with warmth and immediate acceptance. She talked about family recipes that matched ones my mother had made, shared stories about traditions that echoed my own childhood memories, and spoke with the easy familiarity of someone who'd always known we were related. "Honey, the minute I saw your picture on Facebook, I knew we were family," she laughed. "You've got Grandmama Santos's nose and the Williams family stubborn streak written all over your face." Mama used to say Elizabeth's daughter would be a force to be reckoned with, and looking at all you've accomplished, I'd say she was right. Within a span of 3 months, my world had expanded from the solitary grief of widowhood to the warm embrace of a family I'd never known existed. Linda called every Tuesday evening, and we'd settled into a comfortable routine of sharing memories and making plans for her visit to Charleston. David sent weekly updates about his daughter's school activities and asked advice about parenting challenges, treating me with the respectful affection due a beloved grandmother. Maria texted constantly, sending photos of her garden, her grandchildren, her attempts at recreating our grandmother's empanada recipe. For the first time since Charles's death, I felt connected to something larger than my grief. I had family beyond Rebecca, people who seemed genuinely interested in knowing me, who asked about my day and remembered the details of my life. Linda wanted to hear stories about our parents that she'd never known. David was eager to learn about Charles's service in Vietnam and his volunteer work with veterans. Maria insisted on planning a family reunion where we could all meet face-to-face and celebrate the miracle of finding each other. Rebecca noticed the change in me immediately. During her twice-weekly visits, she'd comment on my improved mood, my renewed energy, my sudden interest in cooking for more than one person. "You seem different lately, Mom," she said one afternoon in late April, settling into Charles's chair with her usual proprietary air. "More social, are you dating someone?" The question was so ridiculous that I actually laughed out loud. Dating, at 74, hardly dear, but I have been reconnecting with some family members I'd lost touch with over the years. I kept the explanation deliberately vague, not yet ready to share the complexity of these new relationships with Rebecca, who had a tendency to view any new person in my life as potential competition for my attention and resources. Family members. Rebecca's voice sharpened with interest. "What family members? I thought we'd pretty much exhausted our family tree years ago when you and Dad were working on that genealogy project." "It turns out there were some branches we'd missed," I said carefully. "People who'd been separated from the family over the years who are just now finding their way back. It's been wonderful getting to know them." Rebecca's expression shifted in a way I'd learned to recognize over the years. It was the look she got when she sensed an opportunity or a threat, when her mental calculations began running scenarios and outcomes. "That's interesting," she said slowly. "I'd love to meet them sometime. You know how important family is to me." Family had never seemed particularly important to Rebecca beyond its utility to her own goals, but I nodded noncommittally. "I'm sure you'll meet them eventually. Linda is planning to visit soon, and David has been wanting to bring his daughters down for a weekend." Linda and David. Rebecca's voice was carefully casual, but I caught the sharp attention behind her questions. "Those are new names. How exactly are they related to us?" I found myself reluctant to go into details, something that surprised me. Usually, I shared everything with Rebecca, but something about her intensity made me cautious. "Linda is my sister, actually. She was adopted as a baby, but we've recently reconnected. And David is Charles's grandson from before we were married. They're both lovely people." Rebecca nodded thoughtfully, but I noticed she was gripping the arms of Charles's chair tighter than usual. "A sister and a grandson. How wonderful that they found you after all these years. I hope they're not expecting anything from the estate, of course. I mean, legally speaking, they wouldn't have any claim even if they are legitimate relatives." The word legitimate stung more than I expected. "Rebecca, these are family members, not con artists. They're not looking for money. They just want connection, relationship, the same things any family member would want." "Of course, Mom, I didn't mean to suggest otherwise." But her smile didn't reach her eyes, and I noticed she stayed longer than usual that afternoon, asking more questions about Linda and David and Maria, taking mental notes that made me uncomfortable in a way I couldn't quite name. Over the following weeks, my conversations with my newfound family members took on an even deeper intimacy. Linda began sharing more personal struggles, including financial difficulties following her husband's death and medical bills from her recent cancer treatment that had depleted her savings. She never asked for help directly, but the stress in her voice during our Tuesday calls was unmistakable. "I just feel so foolish," she said one evening, her voice thick with tears. "John always handled our finances, and I never learned how to manage investments or plan for retirement. Now I'm 72 years old, trying to figure out how to make ends meet on Social Security alone. Some nights I lie awake wondering what's going to happen to me if I get sick again, if I can't take care of myself anymore." The vulnerability in her confession broke my heart. This was my sister, the baby our parents had given up in hopes of providing her with a better life, and she was struggling alone just as Charles and I had feared we might in our final years. "Linda," I said gently, "you're not alone anymore. You have family now. We take care of each other." David's situation was different but equally concerning. During one of our conversations, he mentioned that his ex-wife was threatening to seek full custody of his daughters unless he could provide better financial stability. His carpentry business had been slow due to the economic uncertainty, and he was behind on rent for his workshop. "I'm not asking for anything, Mrs. Thompson," he said quickly, as if reading my thoughts. "I just needed someone to talk to, someone who might understand what Charles would have wanted me to do. He seems like he was the kind of man who would have good advice about being a father under difficult circumstances." The reverence in David's voice when he spoke about Charles touched me deeply. He'd never known his grandfather, but he spoke about him with the kind of love and respect that many biological grandchildren never develop. Charles always believed that family comes first, I told him. That providing for the people you love is the most important responsibility a man has. He would have been so proud to know about you and your daughters. Maria's challenges were more subtle but no less real. She was caring for her elderly mother-in-law while dealing with her own health issues and helping to support her adult son who'd recently lost his job. She never complained directly, but during our frequent conversations, the weight of her responsibilities was evident. Sometimes I think about what life would have been like if our families had never been separated, she mused during one of our calls. All the support we could have given each other over the years, all the celebrations we missed, all the times we could have helped each other through the hard patches. Family is supposed to be your safety net, you know, the people who catch you when you fall. Her words resonated with something deep in my chest. I had money sitting in investment accounts that I'd never need. Funds that Charles and I had accumulated with the intention of leaving them to Rebecca, but that could make such a meaningful difference in the lives of these newly discovered family members who actually seemed to value relationship over inheritance. The more I thought about it, the more sense it made to adjust my will to include Linda, David, and Maria. Not because they were asking for anything, but because they were family and family takes care of family. Charles would have wanted that. He'd always been generous with people he cared about, always willing to help a friend or neighbor in need. I made an appointment with my attorney to discuss revisions to my estate planning. Nothing dramatic, I told myself. Just some adjustments to reflect my expanded family. Maybe give each of my newfound relatives $100,000, reducing Rebecca's inheritance from $1.8 million to $1.5 million, which was still more than generous for a woman who'd already received substantial financial help from her parents throughout her adult life. But before I could meet with the lawyer, Rebecca appeared at my door on a Thursday afternoon, her expression more serious than usual. She'd brought lunch from my favorite deli, claiming she wanted to spend quality time together, but something in her demeanor suggested this wasn't a casual visit. "Mom, I've been thinking about our conversation the other day," she said as we sat down to eat. "About these family members who have suddenly appeared in your life. I'm concerned about you, about the possibility that you might be vulnerable to people who could take advantage of your generous nature." I set down my sandwich, suddenly no longer hungry. "What exactly are you suggesting, Rebecca?" "I'm not suggesting anything definitive. I'm just saying that it's awfully convenient that these long-lost relatives have all appeared right around the same time, right when you're dealing with grief and loneliness after Dad's death. Scammers know how to target people in vulnerable situations." The implication that I was too naive or grief-addled to recognize genuine family connections stung. "These aren't scammers, Rebecca. Linda knows details about our parents that no stranger could know. David has photographs that prove his connection to your father. Maria shares family traits and memories that can't be fabricated. But have you verified any of this independently? Have you done DNA tests or hired investigators to confirm their claims? Because if you're thinking about including them in your will, you need to be absolutely certain they are who they claim to be." The fact that Rebecca immediately jumped to concerns about the will told me everything I needed to know about her motivations. This wasn't about protecting me from con artists. This was about protecting her inheritance from legitimate family members. "I'm perfectly capable of making my own decisions about my estate," I said firmly. "And yes, if these people are genuinely family, I would want to provide for them. That's what families do." Rebecca's carefully controlled expression slipped for just a moment, revealing a flash of panic. "Mom, you've already made promises to Dad's favorite charities, and we've talked about this. I've been counting on my inheritance to secure my retirement, to finally give me the financial stability I've been working toward my whole life." There it was, the truth beneath all her concern and protective instincts. Rebecca wasn't worried about me being scammed. She was worried about her inheritance being reduced. "Rebecca, you'll still inherit more money than most people see in a lifetime, but these are family members who need help, who could genuinely benefit from some financial assistance." "Family members you've known for less than 6 months," Rebecca said, her voice rising slightly. People who showed up just in time to benefit from your estate planning. Doesn't that timing seem suspicious to you? Our conversation ended badly, with Rebecca storming out after making vague threats about having me evaluated for mental competency if I made any rash decisions about my will. The confrontation left me shaken and sad, but also more determined than ever to include Linda, David, and Maria in my estate planning. Rebecca's selfish reaction had only reinforced my belief that these newly discovered family members who wanted nothing more than connection and relationship were more deserving of my generosity than a daughter who viewed me primarily as a source of future wealth. I called Linda that evening, needing the comfort of her warm, understanding voice. She listened patiently as I described the confrontation with Rebecca, offering the kind of sisterly support I'd never known I was missing. "Oh, honey," Linda said gently, "I can only imagine how painful that must have been. It's always hard when children view their parents' love as a finite resource, as if caring about other people somehow diminishes what you feel for them. But that's not how family works, is it? Love multiplies when it's shared." Her wisdom and compassion were exactly what I needed to hear. This was what real family relationships looked like. Not the calculating, transactional dynamic I'd developed with Rebecca, but genuine care and mutual support. The family reunion was scheduled for a Sunday afternoon in early June. Linda was driving down from Atlanta, where she'd been visiting a friend. David was bringing his daughters from Asheville. Maria was coming up from Savannah with her famous peach cobbler and photo albums full of pictures I'd never seen. We decided to have the gathering at my house in the garden that Charles had loved, surrounded by the magnolia trees and rose bushes that had been witnesses to our decades of marriage. I spent the entire week preparing, cleaning the house from top to bottom, planning a menu that would showcase the best of Southern cooking, arranging fresh flowers in every room. It felt like preparing for Christmas morning, that same anticipation of joy and togetherness and the creation of new memories that would last a lifetime. Sunday morning arrived bright and clear, with the kind of perfect June weather that made Charleston feel like heaven on earth. I was in the kitchen putting finishing touches on the coconut cake when I heard cars pulling into the driveway. My heart raced with excitement as I smoothed my dress and checked my reflection in the hallway mirror. I'd chosen to wear the navy blue dress with tiny pearl buttons that Charles had always said made me look elegant. Today felt like the kind of occasion that deserved elegance. The sound of voices drifted through the house as my guests made their way to the front door. I could hear Linda's warm laughter, David's deeper voice speaking to what must be his daughters, Maria's musical accent mixing with the general excitement of people meeting for the first time. This was it, the moment when my scattered family would finally come together as one. But as I walked toward the living room to greet them, I heard something that made my blood freeze in my veins. It was Linda's voice, but she wasn't talking to me or to the other guests. She was speaking in a lower tone, more businesslike, to someone I couldn't see. "Did you remember to bring the updated coaching notes?" she was saying, "because Maggie mentioned that her attorney appointment is scheduled for Wednesday and we need to make sure everyone's story stays consistent through the will signing." I stopped walking, my heart hammering so hard I was sure everyone in the house could hear it. Coaching notes, will signing, what were they talking about? David's voice joined the conversation. "Everything's in my car, the revised family photos, the backup documentation, and the payment schedule for next month. How long do you think this final performance needs to last?" Performance? The word hit me like a physical blow. I gripped the doorframe to steady myself, straining to hear more of a conversation that was dismantling my entire world with every word. "Probably through the end of June," came another voice. Maria, but her warm, musical accent was gone, replaced by something clipped and professional. "Rebecca wants to make sure the will is updated and legally binding before we phase out contact. After that, it's just a matter of waiting for the old lady to die so we can collect our fees." The old lady, they were talking about me like I was a mark in a con game, a target to be manipulated and discarded. The sister who'd called me every Tuesday, the grandson who'd asked for advice about parenting, the cousin who'd texted me photos of her garden, all of it was fake. All of it was performance. All of it was designed to steal my money and break my heart, but the cruelest revelation was yet to come. Because then I heard Rebecca's voice speaking with the casual authority of someone in charge of the entire operation. "Perfect. And remember, if she starts getting suspicious or asking too many questions, just lean into the emotional manipulation. Talk about how much family means to you, how grateful you are to have found her, how much you love her. She eats that up. The lonelier they are, the easier they fall for it. My daughter, my only child, the baby I'd carried and birthed and raised and loved unconditionally for 45 years, was orchestrating an elaborate con game designed to manipulate me into changing my will. She'd hired professional actors to pose as my family members, coached them on our family history, taught them to prey on my loneliness and grief. I must have made some sound because suddenly the conversation in the living room stopped. There was a moment of terrible silence and then Rebecca's voice, sharp with alarm, "Did you hear something?" I backed away from the doorway on trembling legs, my mind reeling with the magnitude of the betrayal. 8 months of carefully constructed relationships, 8 months of growing love and trust and hope for the future, 8 months of believing I'd found the family I'd never known I was missing. All of it was a lie orchestrated by the one person in the world I'd thought I could trust absolutely. The voices in the living room became urgent whispers and I could hear movement, people positioning themselves for whatever came next. They knew I'd overheard them. They knew their carefully constructed performance had been exposed. But what would they do now? Continue the charade and hope I'd doubt my own ears, drop the act entirely and reveal the full scope of their deception. I didn't wait to find out. Moving as quietly as I could manage on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, I slipped out the back door and into Charles's garden, where the magnolia trees he'd planted for our 10th anniversary provided shelter from the view of the house. I needed air, needed space, needed a moment to process what I'd just learned before facing the people who'd been systematically destroying my heart for the better part of a year. The garden was exactly as Charles had left it, a testament to his patience and love and attention to beauty. The roses were blooming in shades of pink and white and deep red, their fragrance mixing with the heavier scent of magnolia blossoms. This was where Charles and I had shared our morning coffee for 20 years, where we'd planned our retirement and talked about growing old together and dreamed of grandchildren who would play among these flowers. But there would be no grandchildren. David's daughters were probably just more actors, paid to play the role of the granddaughters I'd never have. The photos he'd shown me were probably stock images purchased online. The stories about their school activities and teenage concerns were probably scripted fiction designed to make me feel needed and valued. From the house came the sound of urgent conversation, though I couldn't make out the words from my hiding place among the magnolias. They were probably deciding how to handle my discovery, whether to continue the performance or abandon it entirely. Maybe they were calculating how much of my will revision they could still salvage, how much money they could still extract from a 74-year-old woman whose greatest crime had been longing for family connection after losing her husband. The cruelty of it took my breath away. It wasn't just the money, though the financial manipulation was devastating enough. It was the emotional abuse, the way they'd identified my deepest vulnerabilities and exploited them with surgical precision. Rebecca knew how isolated I'd felt after Charles's death, how much I'd grieved not just for my husband but for the family connections that had died with him. She'd weaponized that grief, turned it into a tool for stealing from me. Linda's Tuesday phone calls, which had become the highlight of my week, were probably scheduled obligations. David's requests for advice about his daughters were probably copied from parenting websites. Maria's texts about her garden and her cooking were probably generated by someone who'd never set foot in Georgia, let alone grown up there. Every warm moment, every intimate conversation, every expression of love and gratitude and family connection had been carefully manufactured by people who viewed me not as a human being deserving of love and respect, but as a resource to be harvested. They'd studied me like scientists studying a lab rat, learning my behaviors and responses and triggers so they could more effectively manipulate me into giving them what they wanted. The sound of the back door opening made me look up from my hiding place. Rebecca stood on the porch, her expression a mixture of concern and calculation as she scanned the garden. She'd changed from her usual sharp business attire into a flowing sundress that made her look younger, more innocent. Even now, even when she knew I'd discovered the truth, she was still performing. "Mom," she called out, her voice pitched to carry just the right note of worried confusion. "Where are you? Linda and David and Maria are here for the reunion. They're so excited to see you." Linda and David and Maria. She was still using their names as if they were real people, as if the relationships I'd built with them had any substance beyond the contracts Rebecca had signed with their talent agency. The casual cruelty of it made me want to scream. I stood up slowly, brushing magnolia petals from my navy dress, and walked back toward the house where the people who'd been systematically destroying my emotional life for 8 months were waiting to see how much more damage they could inflict. Rebecca's face lit up with relief when she saw me, but I noticed she positioned herself between me and the back door as if she were afraid I might try to run. "There you are," she said, her voice warm with artificial affection. "I was worried about you. You disappeared right when everyone arrived." "I needed some air," I said quietly, "and some time to think about what I'd heard." Rebecca's expression flickered, but she recovered quickly. "What you heard, what do you mean?" Even now, even when we both knew the truth, she was going to make me say it out loud. She was going to force me to confront the full scope of her betrayal, to voice the unthinkable reality that my own daughter had hired actors to pretend to love me so she could steal my inheritance. "I heard you discussing payment schedules," I said, my voice steady despite the trembling in my chest. "I heard you talking about coaching notes and performance timelines and waiting for the old lady to die." The mask slipped from Rebecca's face like ice melting in summer heat. For just a moment I saw her as she really was, not the concerned daughter or the successful businesswoman, but a cold, calculating person who'd orchestrated months of emotional abuse for financial gain. Then the mask slipped back into place and she was my daughter again, wide-eyed and confused. "Mom, I think there might be some misunderstanding. You're 74 years old and grief can sometimes make us hear things that aren't really there, interpret innocent conversations in ways that seem threatening or concerning." She was gaslighting me. After orchestrating the most elaborate emotional manipulation I could have imagined, she was trying to convince me that I was mentally incompetent, that my own ears couldn't be trusted. The technique was so smooth, so practiced, that I wondered how many times she'd used it on me before, how many of my perceptions and memories she'd subtly undermined over the years. "Rebecca," I said, and something in my tone made her stop talking. "I know exactly what I heard. I know exactly what's been happening, and I know exactly who you really are." We stared at each other across the porch, mother and daughter, victim and predator, two people who'd shared a lifetime together but who apparently had never really known each other at all. The sounds of conversation drifted from inside the house, where 3 professional actors were probably wondering how much longer they'd need to maintain their performances. "What do you want me to say, Mom?" Rebecca asked finally, dropping the confused daughter act. "That I'm sorry, that I didn't mean for it to go this far. That I was just trying to secure my financial future in a world that doesn't give women my age very many second chances." The casual way she admitted to the deception, as if it were a minor business decision rather than a devastating betrayal, told me everything I needed to know about the person my daughter had become. There was no remorse, no recognition of the emotional damage she'd inflicted, no understanding that what she'd done was profoundly cruel. "I want you to call off your actors," I said. "I want you to end this charade and get these people out of my house, and then I want you to leave and not come back." Rebecca's expression hardened. "You can't be serious. These are family members, Mom, people who love you and want to be part of your life. Are you really going to throw away these relationships because of some misunderstood conversation?" Even now, even when the truth was laid bare between us, she was still trying to manipulate me. Still trying to convince me that up was down, that black was white, that professional actors hired to defraud me were actually loving family members who deserved my trust and my money. "They're not family members," I said. "They're employees, your employees, and this conversation is over." I walked past Rebecca into my house, where 3 strangers were sitting in my living room pretending to be people they weren't. Linda was perched on the edge of my sofa, her expression carefully arranged in lines of concern. David was standing by the fireplace, looking appropriately worried about his supposed grandmother's well-being. Maria was in Charles's chair, the chair where my husband had read his final newspaper, and something about seeing her there made my anger finally break through the shock and hurt. "Get out," I said, my voice cutting through their murmured conversations about where I might have gone. "All of you, get out of my house right now." Linda's face crumpled into an expression of hurt confusion. "Maggie, honey, what's wrong? What happened? We've been so worried about you." The performance was flawless. If I hadn't overheard their backstage conversation, I would have been completely convinced by her concern, but knowing it was all an act made it grotesque, like watching someone dance on a grave. "I know who you are," I said. "I know why you're here." And I know exactly how much Rebecca is paying you to pretend to love me." The three actors exchanged glances, and I could see them making rapid calculations about whether to continue the performance or abandon it entirely. David stepped forward, his expression earnest and pleading. "Mrs. Thompson, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. I'm your grandson. I have photographs, DNA evidence, family documents that prove our connection. Whatever Rebecca might have said to confuse you." "Stop," I said, holding up my hand. "Just stop. I heard you discussing coaching notes and payment schedules and waiting for me to die. I heard you call me the old lady like I was nothing more than a mark in a con game. So please spare me any more of your professional acting." The pretense finally cracked. Linda's concerned grandmother expression melted away, replaced by something businesslike and cold. David stepped back from the fireplace, his shoulders dropping as he abandoned the deferential posture of a devoted grandson. Maria rose from Charles's chair, her musical accent disappearing as she spoke in flat, professional tones. "Look, Mrs. Thompson, this doesn't have to get ugly. We're just trying to make a living, and Rebecca hired us for a specific job. If you want us to leave, we'll leave. But there's no need to make this more complicated than it needs to be." The casual way she dismissed 8 months of intimate conversations, 8 months of building what I thought was love and trust and family connection, as nothing more than a job, was breathtaking in its callousness. These people had studied my loneliness, my grief, my desperate desire for family, and they'd used that knowledge to systematically manipulate me for money. But they were small players in a much larger betrayal. The real architect of this cruelty, the person who'd identified my vulnerabilities and hired professionals to exploit them, was standing behind me on the porch, watching her carefully constructed plan fall apart. "Rebecca," I said without turning around, "give them whatever final payment they're owed and get them out of my house. And then I want to talk to you." The next 20 minutes passed in a blur of awkward goodbyes and hastily gathered belongings. Linda tried one final performance, tears streaming down her cheeks as she begged me to reconsider, to not throw away the beautiful relationship we'd built over a simple misunderstanding. David attempted to leave behind the family photographs that were supposedly proof of our connection. Maria hugged me with what she claimed was genuine affection, despite the fact that everything about her identity was fabricated. I stood in my hallway like a statue while these strangers who'd been intimate parts of my life for 8 months transformed back into the professional actors they'd always been. They were good at their jobs, I had to give them that. Even knowing the truth, part of me wanted to believe that some small portion of their affection had been real. But when the front door finally closed behind them and their rental cars disappeared down Magnolia Street, the house felt different. Not empty the way it had after Charles died, but contaminated. These people had sat in my chairs, eaten at my table, touched my photographs and belongings while calculating how much money they could extract from my loneliness. Every surface they'd contacted felt tainted by their deception. Rebecca remained on the porch, probably deciding whether to attempt more manipulation or cut her losses and leave. When I joined her in the garden, she was sitting on the wrought iron bench where Charles and I used to watch the sunset, her expression unreadable. "How long have you been planning this?" I asked, settling into the chair across from her. "About a year," she said, apparently deciding that honesty was her best option now that the deception had collapsed. "After Dad died and I realized how isolated you'd become, how vulnerable you were to the right kind of approach." The clinical way she described my grief, as if it were a business opportunity rather than the natural response to losing the love of my life, made me feel sick. "And the actors, how did you find them?" "There are agencies that specialize in this kind of work. Long-term relationship fraud, inheritance manipulation, elder care deception. It's more common than you might think. Lonely older people with substantial assets are considered prime targets." Rebecca spoke with the detached professionalism of someone discussing a legitimate business venture rather than a criminal conspiracy to defraud her own mother. The emotional distance in her voice was perhaps more devastating than the betrayal itself. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of poor judgment. This was calculated, premeditated emotional abuse designed to steal from someone she was supposed to love. "Did any of it mean anything to you?" I asked. "Watching me fall in love with these fake family members, seeing how happy I was to have people in my life who seemed to care about me, did you feel anything at all?" Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, and I found myself hoping for some sign of remorse, some indication that the daughter I'd raised still existed somewhere beneath the cold stranger sitting across from me. But when she finally spoke, her words extinguished that hope completely. "I felt proud of how well the plan was working," she said. "These actors are expensive, and the return on investment was going to be substantial. You were ready to change your will to include all three of them, which would have reduced the charitable donations and left more assets for me to inherit eventually." Even her admission was framed in financial terms. Not "I felt proud of manipulating my mother's emotions," but proud of how well the plan was working. Not "I was stealing from you," but optimizing return on investment. She'd managed to turn matricide into a business model. "What made you think I wouldn't eventually discover the truth?" I asked. "Statistical analysis," Rebecca said, as if she were discussing a marketing campaign rather than a plan to destroy her mother's emotional life. "Most elderly victims of family fraud never realize what's happening. They're too isolated, too trusting, too desperate for connection to question relationships that make them feel loved. And even if they do become suspicious, they usually don't have the resources or energy to investigate thoroughly." She'd reduced me to a demographic, a predictable set of behaviors and vulnerabilities that could be exploited with the right strategy. The person who'd given her life, raised her, sacrificed for her dreams and ambitions was nothing more than an elderly target with exploitable weaknesses. "The only variable I didn't account for," Rebecca continued, "was your walking into the living room at exactly the wrong moment. If you'd stayed in the kitchen for another 5 minutes, we could have transitioned smoothly into the family reunion performance, and you never would have known what you'd heard." The casual way she discussed the near miss, as if my discovering their deception was simply bad timing rather than justice, told me that she felt no guilt about what she'd done. Her only regret was that she'd been caught. "Rebecca," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "you're my daughter. I love you. I've always loved you, even when you made choices I didn't understand, even when you disappointed me or broke my heart. But this, what you've done to me, I don't know how to come back from this." For the first time since the confrontation began, something flickered across Rebecca's face that might have been emotion. But it was gone so quickly I might have imagined it, replaced by the calculating expression I'd come to recognize as her true self. "I'm sorry you're hurt," she said, though her tone suggested she was sorry I'd discovered the deception, not sorry she'd orchestrated it. "But you have to understand, I was protecting my future. You and Dad always talked about the importance of planning ahead, of making smart financial decisions. This was just another kind of planning." She was trying to reframe her betrayal as a lesson she'd learned from her parents, as if Charles and I had somehow taught her that manipulating vulnerable people was an acceptable financial strategy. The twisted logic was so profound that I wondered if she actually believed it, or if this was just another layer of manipulation designed to make me question my own moral judgment. "Your father and I taught you to work hard, to earn what you wanted, to treat people with kindness and respect," I said. "We never taught you to prey on the vulnerable or to view your own mother as a target for fraud." "You taught me that family comes first," Rebecca countered, "that you do whatever it takes to protect the people you love." I was protecting myself, securing my financial future so I could take care of myself when I'm your age. The irony was staggering. She was using the values Charles and I had tried to instill in her to justify systematically destroying the woman who taught her those values in the first place. She'd taken the concept of family loyalty and twisted it into something unrecognizable, a justification for emotional abuse and financial theft. We sat in silence for several minutes, surrounded by the garden Charles had planted with such hope and love. The roses were still blooming, the magnolia trees still providing shade, but everything felt different now. This place where I'd planned to create new memories with my expanded family would forever be associated with the moment my daughter's betrayal was fully revealed. "What happens now?" Rebecca asked finally. It was a fair question and one I'd been dreading since the moment I overheard their conversation. "What did happen now? How did you rebuild a relationship with someone who'd orchestrated such a profound betrayal? How did you trust someone who'd hired professionals to manipulate your emotions for financial gain? Now you leave," I said, "and you don't come back." Rebecca's carefully controlled expression cracked slightly. "Mom, you can't be serious. I'm your daughter. I'm the only family you have." The cruel irony of her words wasn't lost on me. For 8 months, I'd believed I had a sister who called me every Tuesday, a grandson who asked for my advice, a cousin who shared family recipes. But they'd been lies, performances, carefully constructed deceptions designed to make me feel loved while systematically stealing from me. Now the architect of those deceptions was claiming to be my only real family. "You stopped being my family the moment you hired actors to manipulate me," I said. "Family members don't prey on each other's vulnerabilities. They don't hire professionals to exploit loneliness and grief. They don't orchestrate elaborate deceptions to steal inheritance money." "I wasn't stealing," Rebecca protested. "The money was always going to come to me eventually. I was just ensuring that it came to me instead of being wasted on charities that wouldn't even remember your name after you died." Even her defense was purely transactional. Not "I wasn't trying to hurt you" or "I never meant for it to go this far," but "I wasn't stealing because the money was rightfully mine anyway." She viewed my entire estate as her property, temporarily held by someone who was too sentimental to distribute it properly. "Those charities represent causes your father and I cared about," I said. "Children's health care, adult literacy, education opportunities for people who couldn't afford them otherwise. We wanted our money to continue doing good in the world after we were gone, to be part of something larger than our own family legacy." "Dad's dead," Rebecca said bluntly. "He doesn't care what happens to the money now, and you'll be dead too, eventually. The only person who will be affected by your estate planning decisions is me, and I'm the one who has to live with the consequences of your choices." The callousness of reducing Charles to dead and dismissing my own future death as an irrelevant inevitability was breathtaking. But it also clarified something important about who Rebecca really was. She didn't just lack empathy for my emotional pain. She lacked empathy entirely, viewing other people as obstacles to be managed or resources to be harvested. "You're right about one thing," I said. "You are the one who has to live with the consequences of my choices. And I choose not to enable someone who views emotional manipulation and elder abuse as acceptable business strategies." I stood up from the garden chair, my legs steadier than I'd expected them to be. The shock was wearing off, replaced by something cleaner and more purposeful. Clarity, maybe, or just the relief of finally seeing clearly after months of being deliberately confused. "I'm calling my attorney tomorrow," I said. "I'm removing you from my will entirely. Every penny of my estate will go to the charities your father and I originally planned to support. You won't inherit a single dollar from me." Rebecca's mask slipped completely, revealing the cold fury that had probably been simmering beneath her performance for years. "You can't do that. I'm your only child, your only heir. Legally, I have rights." "Legally, you have the right to contest my will after I die," I interrupted. "But you don't have the right to inherit from someone you've systematically abused. And make no mistake, Rebecca, what you've done to me is abuse. Emotional abuse, financial abuse, elder abuse. All of it designed to manipulate me into giving you money you hadn't earned and didn't deserve." The word abuse hung in the air between us like a challenge. Rebecca had probably convinced herself that her actions were clever business strategies, sophisticated planning, maybe even loving protection of family assets. But calling it what it actually was, abuse, stripped away all the euphemisms and justifications. "I could have you declared mentally incompetent," Rebecca said, her voice low and threatening. "Elderly people who make irrational decisions about their estates, who cut out their only children based on paranoid delusions, can be found legally incapable of managing their own affairs." The threat was delivered with the same casual professionalism she used to describe hiring the actors, as if destroying my legal autonomy was just another business decision. But it also revealed the desperation beneath her controlled exterior. She was running out of manipulation strategies and moving toward more direct forms of attack. "You could try," I said, "but you'd have to explain to a judge why your supposedly mentally incompetent mother was able to uncover your elaborate fraud scheme. You'd have to admit that you hired actors to manipulate me, which would open you up to criminal charges for elder abuse and fraud. And you'd have to hope that a court would find it more reasonable to believe that I'm mentally incompetent than to believe that you're a criminal." The calculation in Rebecca's expression told me she was weighing the odds, considering whether she could successfully paint me as a confused elderly woman who'd imagined the entire deception. But we both knew she'd left too much evidence, involved too many people, operated too openly to successfully gaslight a legal system that would actually investigate her claims. "You're making a mistake," she said finally. "I'm the only family you have left." When you're sick, when you need help, when you're dying alone in this house, you're going to regret pushing away the one person who would have taken care of you." The cruelest part of her threat was that she was probably right. I was 74 years old, living alone in a big house, with no children or grandchildren or siblings to care for me as I aged. The fake family members she'd provided had been filling a real void in my life, meeting a genuine need for connection and support. Cutting her out of my life meant accepting that I would face the challenges of aging entirely alone. But it also meant freeing myself from someone who viewed my vulnerability as an opportunity, who saw my need for family connection as a tool for manipulation. Living alone was frightening, but living with someone who would abuse my trust for financial gain was worse. I'd rather die alone than live with someone who sees me as nothing more than a source of inheritance money, I said. At least when I'm alone, I know the solitude is honest. Rebecca stood up abruptly, her designer sundress catching the late afternoon breeze. For a moment she looked like the little girl she'd once been, stubborn and calculating even at age 5, always working an angle to get what she wanted. But that little girl had grown into someone unrecognizable, someone capable of orchestrating months of emotional abuse against her own mother. "This isn't over," she said, reaching into her purse for her car keys. "You think you've won something, but all you've done is guarantee that you'll spend your final years alone with no one who cares about you, no one who'll even know when you die." She walked toward the house, presumably to collect whatever belongings she'd left inside, but paused at the porch steps. "Those actors did care about you, by the way, Linda especially. She told me after one of your phone calls that she was starting to feel genuinely fond of you, that she almost wished the relationship could be real." So when you're sitting in this house by yourself, wondering why no one calls or visits, remember that you had people who wanted to be part of your life, and you threw it away because you couldn't handle the truth about how the world actually works. The parting shot was designed to plant seeds of doubt, to make me question whether I was throwing away genuine affection along with the professional deception. But it also revealed something Rebecca probably hadn't intended to share. Even the actors, people who'd been paid to pretend to love me, had found me likable enough that their professional detachment had begun to crack. If strangers could develop genuine fondness for me during the course of a business transaction, then maybe I wasn't as unlovable or difficult as Rebecca's actions had made me feel. Maybe the problem wasn't with me at all, but with a daughter who was incapable of seeing her mother as anything more than a financial resource. I watched Rebecca's car disappear down Magnolia Street, taking with it the last pretense of our mother-daughter relationship. The silence that followed was different from the hollow quiet that had filled the house after Charles died. This silence felt clean somehow, like the air after a violent storm had cleared. The aftermath of Rebecca's betrayal was both simpler and more complicated than I'd expected. The practical steps were straightforward enough. I called my attorney the next morning and scheduled an appointment to revise my will, completely removing Rebecca as a beneficiary and distributing my entire estate among the Charleston Children's Hospital, the Literacy Foundation, and the Community College Scholarship Fund. The legal fees were substantial, but ensuring that Rebecca wouldn't benefit from my death felt worth any cost. I also contacted the police to report the fraud, though they warned me that prosecution would be difficult since I discovered the deception before any money had actually been transferred. The actors had committed fraud, but proving criminal intent rather than civil deception would require evidence that was hard to obtain. Still, having an official record of Rebecca's actions felt important, both for my own peace of mind and as protection against any future attempts she might make to challenge my mental competency. The emotional recovery was more complex. For weeks after the confrontation, I found myself reaching for the phone on Tuesday evenings, expecting Linda's call before remembering that Linda didn't actually exist. I'd catch myself checking my email for updates from David about his daughter's school activities, or looking for texts from Maria about her latest cooking experiments. The habits of relationship don't disappear overnight, even when you know the relationships were entirely fabricated. But gradually, something unexpected began to emerge from the wreckage of Rebecca's deception, a kind of freedom I hadn't experienced in years, maybe decades. Without the weight of managing Rebecca's approval, without the constant calculation of how my choices might affect her inheritance expectations, without the pressure of maintaining a relationship with someone who viewed me primarily as a source of future wealth, I could finally make decisions based purely on what I wanted and needed. I started taking art classes at the senior center, something I'd always wanted to try but had never prioritized. I joined a book club at the local library, rediscovering the joy of discussing literature with people who'd chosen to spend time with me rather than people who were being paid to pretend to enjoy my company. I began volunteering at the Children's Hospital, reading to young patients and helping their families navigate the complex emotions of pediatric illness. These new relationships developed slowly, built on genuine shared interests rather than fabricated family histories. The people I met didn't love me instantly the way Rebecca's actors had claimed to, but their affection, when it came, felt real in ways I'd forgotten were possible. They liked me for who I actually was, not for the inheritance I represented or the emotional vulnerabilities they could exploit. 6 months after the confrontation, I received a letter from Rebecca. No return address, postmarked from somewhere in Florida, filled with the kind of manipulative language I'd learned to recognize during our final conversation. She was sorry I'd been hurt by a misunderstanding. She hoped time would help me see that family was more important than holding grudges. She'd found a new business opportunity and could really use some investment capital from someone who believed in her potential. Even in her apology, she was asking for money. Even when trying to rebuild our relationship, she was treating me like a potential investor rather than a mother she'd systematically betrayed. I threw the letter away without finishing it, feeling nothing but pity for someone who'd destroyed the most important relationship in her life and still couldn't understand why. The second letter arrived 3 months later, this one more desperate and direct. Rebecca had apparently burned through whatever money she'd saved and was facing eviction from her apartment. She needed help, needed family, needed me to remember that blood was thicker than water and mothers were supposed to support their children unconditionally. This letter I kept, not out of any renewed affection for Rebecca, but as a reminder of why I'd made the right choice. The woman who'd hired actors to manipulate my emotions was now trying to manipulate me directly, using the same strategies of emotional blackmail and family guilt that had probably worked on me for decades before I'd learned to recognize them. A year after the family reunion that had exposed Rebecca's deception, I was in my garden planting bulbs that would bloom the following spring when my neighbor Mrs. Patterson knocked on the gate. She was holding an envelope that had been misdelivered to her address, a thick packet with legal markings and official stamps. Inside was a notice that Rebecca had filed a lawsuit challenging my mental competency and demanding control of my estate. According to the documents, she was claiming that I'd been manipulated by unscrupulous individuals into making irrational decisions about my will, and that my age and grief had made me vulnerable to exploitation by people who didn't have my best interests at heart. The irony was breathtaking. The person who'd actually manipulated me, who'd actually exploited my age and grief for financial gain, was now claiming in court that other people had done exactly what she'd done. She was painting herself as my protector, fighting to save me from the kind of emotional and financial abuse she'd orchestrated herself. My attorney assured me that Rebecca's case was weak, built on speculation rather than evidence, and unlikely to succeed given the documentation we had of her actual fraud scheme. But the lawsuit would be expensive to defend against, time-consuming to resolve, and emotionally draining to endure. Even from a distance, even after being completely cut out of my life, Rebecca was still finding ways to make my life difficult and costly. The legal battle lasted 8 months and cost nearly $50,000 in attorney fees, money that could have gone to the charities I'd planned to support or to improving my quality of life during my remaining years. But when the judge finally dismissed Rebecca's case, ruling that there was no credible evidence of mental incompetency and substantial evidence of fraud on Rebecca's part, the victory felt worth every penny I'd spent. The court record was now clear and permanent. Rebecca Thompson had hired actors to defraud her elderly mother, had attempted to manipulate estate planning through emotional abuse, and had filed frivolous lawsuits when her criminal scheme failed. Any future attempts she might make to challenge my competency or claim inheritance rights would have to contend with her documented history of elder abuse. 2 years after that devastating Sunday afternoon when I discovered the truth about my fake family, I was finally free to build a life based on honesty rather than manipulation, on genuine relationships rather than financial transactions disguised as love. The house on Magnolia Street felt different now, lighter somehow, as if Rebecca's toxic presence had been like smoke in the air, invisible but poisonous, affecting everything until it was finally cleared away. Charles's chair in the living room no longer felt like a shrine to loss, but like a comfortable place to read and remember good times. The garden bloomed with the same beauty it had always possessed, but now I could enjoy it without wondering which family members were performing their affection and which were genuinely glad to be there. My new life wasn't perfect. There were still lonely evenings when I wished I had family to call, still moments when I felt the particular kind of sadness that comes from aging without children or grandchildren to share the experience. But the loneliness was clean now, honest, free from the contamination of people who pretended to care while systematically betraying my trust. The volunteers at the children's hospital knew my real personality, not a carefully constructed performance designed to extract money from my emotions. The other members of my book club chose to spend time with me because they enjoyed my company, not because they were being paid to pretend they found me interesting. The art instructor who praised my watercolor technique was responding to actual improvement in my skills, not manipulating my self-esteem as part of a long-term financial strategy. These relationships might not have had the immediate intensity of the fake family connections Rebecca had provided, but they had something more valuable: authenticity. When people laughed at my stories, they were actually amused. When they asked about my day, they actually wanted to know. When they expressed concern about my health or well-being, they were responding to genuine care rather than professional obligation. On my 76th birthday, exactly 2 years after the devastating party where no one had come because they were all on Rebecca's cruise, I threw another celebration. This time I invited my book club friends, my volunteer colleagues from the hospital, and my neighbors from Magnolia Street. The guest list was smaller than I'd originally planned for that first party, but every single person who came was there because they wanted to celebrate with me, not because they were performing a role in someone else's elaborate deception. We ate cake in Charles's garden, shared stories about our lives and families, laughed about the books we'd read and the art projects we'd attempted. Mrs. Patterson brought flowers from her garden. James from the book club played guitar and led us in singing old songs that made me remember being young. Sarah from the hospital brought photos of the children we'd been working with, kids whose faces lit up when volunteers came to read with them. As the evening wound down and my guests began to leave, each one hugging me goodbye and thanking me for a lovely time, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: the warm satisfaction of being surrounded by people who genuinely enjoyed my company. Not because I represented financial opportunity, not because they were being paid to pretend affection, but because they'd chosen to be part of my life and I'd chosen to be part of theirs. Later, as I was cleaning up the cake plates and wine glasses, I found myself thinking about Rebecca. Somewhere out there, she was probably still running whatever schemes she'd moved on to after our relationship ended. Still manipulating people, still viewing human connections as transactions, still unable to understand that the most valuable things in life couldn't be bought or stolen or inherited. I felt sorry for her, in a way I hadn't been able to feel when the betrayal was fresh and the pain was raw. She'd given up the unconditional love of a mother, the security of genuine family connection, the comfort of relationships built on honesty and mutual care. She'd traded all of that for a chance at money she hadn't earned, and in the process she'd lost something infinitely more valuable than any inheritance. But I also felt grateful to her, strange as that might sound. Her betrayal had forced me to examine every relationship in my life, to distinguish between connections based on genuine affection and those based on obligation, manipulation, or expectation of future benefit. It had taught me to value authenticity over intensity, to prefer honest solitude to dishonest companionship. Most importantly, it had shown me that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined. At 74, facing the complete destruction of the family relationship I'd thought would sustain me through my final years, I'd found the courage to start over, to build new connections, develop new interests, create new sources of meaning and joy in my life. The woman who'd sat in her empty dining room 2 years ago, staring at untouched place settings and wondering why no one had come to celebrate her birthday, had been broken by betrayal but not destroyed by it. She'd picked up the pieces of her shattered expectations and built something new, something smaller maybe but infinitely more genuine. As I turned off the lights and headed upstairs to bed, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. The face looking back at me was older, lined with the evidence of pain and recovery, but the eyes were clearer than they'd been in years. They belonged to someone who'd learned to distinguish between performance and authenticity, between manipulation and love, between the relationships that drain you and the ones that sustain you. Tomorrow was Monday, which meant art class in the morning with Alina and her infectious laughter whenever she mixed the wrong colors, and volunteer reading in the afternoon with little Sarah, who always asked me to do different voices for each character in her favorite stories. Simple pleasures with people who'd chosen to spend time with me for no reason other than mutual enjoyment. No hidden agendas, no calculation of what they might gain from my friendship. Not the elaborate family reunion I'd once dreamed of, with its carefully orchestrated conversations and perfectly timed emotional moments designed to manipulate my heartstrings and my bank account. Not the Tuesday evening phone calls from a sister who existed only in Rebecca's imagination and a talent agency's files. Not the handwritten letters from a grandson who'd been paid to study my late husband's military records and volunteer work to create convincing fictional memories, but something infinitely better. Genuine relationships built on shared interests, mutual respect, and the slow development of trust that comes from consistent, honest interaction over time. When Alina laughed at my attempts to paint water lilies, she was responding to actual amusement, not performing joy for a monthly payment. When little Sarah hugged my legs after story time, she was expressing real affection, not following a script designed to make me feel valued and needed. These connections might not have had the immediate intensity of Rebecca's manufactured family drama, but they possess something far more precious: authenticity. The foundation of every conversation was honesty rather than deception. Every gesture of care was voluntary rather than paid for. Every moment of laughter was spontaneous rather than calculated. As I drifted off to sleep in the house Charles and I had filled with genuine love for over 4 decades, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before his death. Complete peace with who I was and who I'd chosen to have in my life. No more wondering if people really cared about me or just my bank account. No more second-guessing every expression of affection, searching for signs of manipulation beneath the surface. Just the quiet satisfaction of knowing that tomorrow would bring another day of authentic relationships with people who saw me as Margaret Thompson, not as a target for inheritance fraud or a resource to be harvested. The woman who'd been systematically betrayed by her own daughter had learned to build something beautiful from the wreckage of that betrayal, a life based entirely on truth.